All right, let's get started. Welcome everybody to the webinar today. My name is Paul, and this is 4 ways to speed up your daily grind. We'll be talking about a couple of advanced tools for mobile and web development teams who want to ship better apps faster. So before we begin, a quick housekeeping slide. One bullet that's not on here, I myself am having throat issues, so this is not WebEx that's causing me to sound like this, so I apologize in advance. But this session will be recorded, and once the presentation is processed and posted, we'll email that to you, everyone who attended. And for any questions, or if you'd like to follow along the conversation, there's a couple ways to do that. Obviously, one, you can use Twitter, the hashtag #JustLetMeCode. You can also use the WebEx channel, chat panel, and then what we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll follow up with whatever questions we don't get to directly and individually later on. So I'd like to introduce, well, myself, but also someone else here from Perfecto. His name is Roy Nuriel. He's the director and product manager over the development tools. Roy, how are you doing today?
Good, Paul. Great to see you. Great to meet you again. Looking forward for this session.
Great. And once again, my name is Paul Bruce. I'm the developer advocate / evangelist here at Perfecto. So what we'll cover today, just to make sure that everybody knows what we're going to get into, is first we're going to talk about integrating real devices into development workflows, particularly the two aspects of development that oftentimes cause a lot of time to be wasted. So first off is validating new features, and then secondly, debugging apps. Secondly, we'll go into what it means to stay really close to the code with testing, particularly with instrumented test frameworks. And for today's example, we'll use Espresso, but many of those same things, the same concepts hold for XCTest too, and in fact, we have product support for that as well. Thirdly, we'll talk about, well, once you go past the IDE and you ship your tests with your code, or once your code gets stored in a repo, what happens to it? And more particularly, how can you introduce better feedback to the conversation and what it costs to do that? What's the time cost and how to improve that time and execution speed through parallel testing? So we'll see an example in Jenkins, but again, same thing holds. You'll see this a script, and the same thing holds for any continuous integration server you have. And then finally, we'll talk about once you have better feedback, what kind of reporting do you need to really make this actionable, and also to share this stuff with others around the team so that issues can be dealt with and defects be resolved as fast as possible. So actually I want to turn it over to Roy for a moment because he's really got a lot of context on why we've got a number of things that we're going to show you today and why we're really focused on time, particularly development time.
So yeah, thanks for the question, Paul. And as you said, to put things in context, in the last year we had many discussions. I personally had many discussions with our customers, talking with them, understanding their processes, what they're doing, what are the main challenges that they face, and what they're trying to achieve. I think what came in most of the cases is that those teams are moving to a high velocity. They're moving from a quarterly release to a monthly release, 2 weeks release. We change the processes, what they're doing, and introduce some challenges that they're facing. They want to run and develop more new functionality, more user stories, rather than dealing with defects. They want to make sure that what they deliver is in high quality. Since the timelines became shorter, they need to introduce more activities earlier in the process in order to be ready to ship on time, okay? And as part of that, they do need to make adjustments to their processes. We'll talk about some of them today. Developers are much more aware to the quality of what they develop. If we look at a couple of years back where developers were mainly focused on new functionality, today we do see them pay more attention to the quality of what they do, to tests that they develop as part of the development. So all in all, today we'll see several of the capabilities. I will drill down to each one of them and we'll elaborate how that change or align to the new practices and change that those teams are facing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's actually start with a poll, because I really want to kind of understand where you folks are coming from that are attending today. I consider this a really big room, and so your feedback is kind of really important to how we're having this conversation today. So the first thing I want to ask is to open up a poll with a question that says, when do you feel that feedback about bugs related to your app's user experience would be most useful? When do you think that feedback would be most useful? Now I'll give about 20 or 30 seconds for you to answer the poll. The more responses we get, the better. But if, as we're waiting for the poll to come in, if we go back to that slide there, if we think about the velocity in terms of the stories that you're able to ship within a given amount of time, and how the quality of the things that you ship, that doesn't change. There's less delta in that. In fact, if anything, the expectation is higher. So we even more have to be on our game, and we have to really maximize the systems that help us deliver this high quality stuff better. We really have to maximize those systems. So we'll close the poll out in about 10 seconds. Just make sure everybody got a chance. And while we close the poll, I just want to say there is a mix of professional testers as well as developers on the call today. So this kind of room that we have here, this virtual room, is a shared and mixed environment full of different opinions and different thoughts about when quality starts to come into play. All right. So if we close the poll,
yeah, it's closed. Yeah.
What we can see, what we're seeing on our side, is that the vast majority of folks say that what they feel that feedback about user experience related bugs really are best served during coding and debugging, and then it tapers off. So what this means to me is that as early as possible, we all agree that almost as early as possible, or the earlier the better. And this is good because that's what this conversation today is all about. So let's start off by talking about how we would integrate real devices into development workflows. See, the importance of going earlier is that what happens is in the development process, any kind of inefficiencies you have lead to a bottleneck, and that bottleneck oftentimes results in bugs. So bugs get skipped over, they get escaped to later stages, potentially even to customers, and those turn into major issues that come right back to development. Now, for some of you that might mean a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. For others, it might mean days. As soon as they release, they see that there was a platform that was missed, that there was a condition that they weren't testing for, and so that defect is escaped. And so what that does isn't just cause you to do more work. There's an opportunity cost associated with that too. What I mean is new functionality. When you're working on new features, that's impeded by any kind of bug fixes that you have to do too. So the less time you spend on bug fixes, the more time you have for new work. But in this case, the more bugs you have, the less time you have to get to innovative stuff, cool stuff, stuff you want to do, new code. And so if we flip this and we talk about what efficient dev cycles look like, when we're talking about these apps that really you need to validate them on devices, and sometimes you need to troubleshoot on a specific device, what does an efficient dev cycle look like with a real device in it? Well, let's break this out into two specific areas of work that we all deal with. One is validating work on our UIs. So locally, and what I mean by locally is on a developer workstation, the first question is, look, how many emulators can I actually run at the same time? And so even for me, just running, I've got a MacBook Air with an i5 here. I'm looking to upgrade. But the thing is, I can only run, like, I think 2 emulators at a time and all my dev tools before I really start to feel that bad. And so I'm a lot less likely to do that, or, you know, the speed at which my coding, that actually is impeded. Also, think about how many form factors and screen sizes that you can represent locally. Again, there's a limit as to how many images and how many emulator profiles that you can really maintain. And by the way, how do we manage these environments? Once you have this whole swath of different images locally, how does the team stay up to date with what is important to test, and how do they manage those things individually on each of these workstations? That becomes troublesome too. Considering the amount of time that we might spend on either fixes to bugs that are coming from maybe testing and also from production, whatever the case may be, when you need to figure out what's going wrong and you step through certain debugging tasks, one of the things you need to ask are, what were the network conditions? And this doesn't just go for native apps, native mobile apps. This goes for web apps that are run on mobile devices as well. A vast majority of the websites out there are viewed on mobile devices. And so this becomes germane to understanding what went wrong in a number of circumstances, particularly network latency. Also, it's really important to know what was running in the background. You know, how much memory was being reserved by other processes, CPU cycles that were being consumed. This all goes into what causes apps to fail on a regular basis. And so what Perfecto has done is integrated some of our technologies directly into the place that you spend most of your time, which is an IDE, an integrated development environment, like, for instance, Android Studio, IntelliJ, Visual Studio. We also have created products or particular features, capabilities that help you in other workflows as well. We'll talk about a thing called DevTunnel in a few moments, but this is a primary facilitator to tool chains outside the IDE, meaning things like Chrome Web Inspect, and in certain circumstances, Xcode for iOS developers as well. So let's actually jump right to that. I want to stop talking and stop sliding things out and actually get to code. So let's take a look at a feature that we've actually created for Android Studio called Run on the Cloud. Now, I've switched over to Android Studio, and I'm just going to use this as an example, but again, we also work with IntelliJ and with Visual Studio and even Eclipse. And so the first thing you see is I'm in Android Studio. I've got an example project up. This is a basic calculator app. In the code window, I have the guts of that, the important calculation that app performs, particularly when it comes to the decimal scale that we use, because not all places in the world have the same exact scale. On the right-hand side, we also see the effects of installing the Perfecto plugin, which is 2 panels, one of which is the Perfecto Lab, and that's where you can actually open up new devices. Now, in this case, I'll actually wake up one of the devices here, and then we'll also switch over to the Perfecto dashboard. In fact, we'll actually talk about the Perfecto dashboard in a few moments. So in this case, I've got a Samsung Galaxy and an HTC One up here as well. In this case, I simply just want to see how this app functions. I want to poke around on it. And these are devices that are literally sitting in a data center. They're physical devices They have cell plans, just like yours does. But there's a number of different things that we can do with that device. So let me go up to the top menu bar here and click the Run on the Cloud button. And what will happen is, in this IDE, Gradle will build our application. So this is my favorite part as a developer, is sitting around waiting for Gradle to build. So once that's completed, the next step it'll perform is to go and upload the latest version of this app that I just built to these devices in the cloud. And so it automatically does that for me after the build's done. Then it'll, of course, it'll install it on these devices, register the application, and launch the application. So with just one click of this button and a few moments of time, I'll be able to start working with this application on real devices, and I'll start to be able to change certain parameters, like, for instance, network latency, right? I'll be able to simulate packet loss. If I really want to, I can set an entirely different location. I can see what it's like to inject an image into the camera of the device. So as we're seeing, it's installing on these two devices. I'm opening up the event log in Android Studio so we can see that. And if you noticed, it's now launched on that device. And I can go and start interacting with this device. I'll actually, the HID shows up. I'll put in some information here. And this is literally like pressing the buttons on the screen. So just think about it. Like, you maybe have that one device. As a developer, you have that one physical device. And oops, you forgot it at work, right? But let's say you're in transit or at home, and you need to actually simulate and troubleshoot a real problem that only occurs on a specific device. Well, now you have access to that. Instead of having to bump the ticket or press pause on your work, you can actually complete your work in real time and close that ticket out, close that task out, right? And that makes you happy. It also makes your team happy. It certainly makes your manager happy and his manager. But more importantly, it makes the user happy. It makes customers happy. It makes people who are experiencing your app, your work, really pleasant, really happy, really pleased. So with one button, we can do all that stuff. That's great. The other thing I want to point out is what I mentioned earlier, DevTunnel. And so DevTunnel is a way of being able to create essentially a really long USB cable between your computer, my laptop here, for instance, and the device in the cloud, right? So think about it like that really long USB cable. What it's really doing under the sheets is creating an SSH, or what I like to call a shush connection. That was a joke. But it's using, in this case, I'm on a Mac, S-Tunnel. So it's using standard components to connect this device within a click of a button. And as you can see, it says DevTunnel session established. What that means is now all the tools that normally rely on being able to be plugged in now work the same way. For instance, if I want to go ahead and start debugging this application, set a breakpoint, I can go ahead and do that here. And when I do that, standard dialog box pops up from Android Studio, says select deployment target. That means pick a device. And so I can pick the device that's sitting a world away from me, just the same as it was plugged into this machine. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And as you can see, what's happening is that it's doing a build once again. And if I open up the event log, we'll start to see those tasks, and you'll start to see ADB commands. ADB stands for Android Debug Bridge. It's the native tools that ship with Android Studio. So we're not doing any funny business. We're allowing you to plug real devices into your own tool chain. And this also works, I posted recently on the Perfecto blog, how you might do React Native using DevTunnel. The fact is, it uses standard components to allow you to connect these devices into whatever workflow you have. So Gradle is making my machine sound like it's about to take off, so just bear with us as that happens. If we step back and we think about what this means, it means that now you can actually debug your applications. You can set up a situation where you now launch an app and set a breakpoint on a specific place that you kind of feel like that's where it's breaking. You know, you can start to poke around, do discovery. And here we go. The Gradle build's finished. What we'll eventually see is now that, yeah, it's still in the process of connecting up ADB. There we go. It's going to launch the activity. Oh, there we go. Good. So now we're seeing normal standard ADB commands go across the wire over in my app debugger console. Let me get rid of some of these windows so that we can actually see what's going on. Now, as I walk through this application, right, I'm going to do the same things I did before. I'm going to pump some data in there. I'm going to make it a really nice tip because I live in Massachusetts. We like to treat people really fairly. And so now when we actually press the calculate button, it's going to engage that logic way down in our application. And it hit our breakpoint almost instantly, just like you would expect from other devices plugged into your machine. It also provides you not only the call stack and the frame, but the variables and their live values as you walk through your application. So this is really valuable for dealing with issues that only show up under specific conditions, on specific platforms. And so we can continue our program in this case. We can keep going on it, and we're good.
So Paul, just to add one comment here, you know, it really opened the entire world for a developer if we look at that way. You can sit here in Boston area and connect to devices in China, in the UK, in Australia, basically all over the world, and control them like you're holding them in your hand, or like they're connected with USB cable to your workstation, which in a way give you the flexibility to isolate problems, solve them faster, and optimize your work.
Mm-hmm. So in the interest of time, let's keep going. The next thing we wanted to say was, look, this is the second way to speed up your work, is to think about the way that you're writing your test. And so what I'm referencing Espresso and XCTest here. I'm going to use Espresso examples, but many of the same exact concepts apply between these two instrumented frameworks that are native for native mobile apps. So for the folks on the call who are familiar with other test frameworks, like for instance Appium, that are based on a WebDriver, Espresso and XCTest are fundamentally different. But on the other hand, what we're seeing when we talk to a lot of customers, when I go to a lot of shows, what we're seeing is that developers are taking up Espresso and XCTest because they're really easy to write, they're very stable, and they use the same code artifacts that they're used to dealing with. We'll see that in just a moment. I'll show you the example here. This really just makes for a much faster testing experience, but it doesn't necessarily do all the same things. WebDriver related, they call them black box testing solutions. They have their place too, and we'll talk about that after I show you the example. But you know, it really depends on where you are. What we find is that a lot of customers use a mix of these, whether they're just transitioning from a lot of Appium tests to other test frameworks, or whether they've got a mix of different people, skills, artifacts from previous development cycles. The fact is, it's really up to you to decide, and there's no one perfect test solution out there. So let's actually see what that looks like in Android Studio. I'll flip back over to my IDE. And actually, I'm going to connect up to that device again. Now, if you notice, I'm about to launch that mobile app, and I've got a whole bunch of options in my personal demonstration cloud here. So if we actually use, let's say, the Samsung 5 that we were talking, that we had open earlier, I believe that is the 601, the 339 number. I'll switch over to a basic test written in Espresso. And for those who are familiar with Appium, you might notice, or Selenium for that matter, you might notice a much more terse, clean syntax, meaning it goes right to selecting elements and then performing actions on them. So this first line, for an example, is that it's grabbing the element called bill value. That's the text field that we're putting our total amount into. The second thing is that it's actually replacing the text in there with our test data. And so we go along the rest of those entry points, we move the sliders along, and then we actually use a check and we verify that it matches the test results that we expect in this circumstance. So in this case, I'll connect up to DevTunnel like I did before. And then the next thing I want to do, just so that we can all see it, since these tests are test in code, and they're code that's in the same IDE and under the same context, what I can do is actually set a breakpoint on my test code as well. Because maybe this test was breaking in CI. Maybe I came in and there were a couple tests, this is one of them, that they were breaking and I don't know why. All of a sudden, I get this report, I need to see what's going on. So I know which test I need to check. I want to set a breakpoint where I think it's starting to fail, or where I think is a good place to step into this test. The next thing I want to do is actually switch over configuration here. I can just as easily right-click that test and say debug. That'll create a configuration. But the point is, I'll switch over to actually debugging this test. And again, just like we saw earlier, it's going to ask us to connect up to this device. Of course, it's going to do the Gradle build again. And once it's done with the Gradle build, you'll see the same exact ADB commands, except for it's going to push the tests up there themselves. Now, one of the big differences between between Espresso and with a WebDriver-based framework is that Espresso compiles the app code, and you can actually have it compile the app code separately in a different binary than all the tests that it's about to ship onto the device. But it literally ships the tests that you're running onto the device, and the tests and the app run on the device all by themselves and exchange communications back and forth from the device, what's going on there, to the client, in this case the IDE that's connected to that debug session. So instead of one at a time sending commands to the device like a WebDriver kit might do, it actually will ship all that stuff over to device and have it run separately. This is one of the key things that allows some of the tests to run faster in some cases. So as we can see, 25 has been entered into the tip percentage, and that's basically the last line that executed in our test. That's here. The line of code that we stopped at was simply just a way for me to do like a quick validation and say, yeah, this is the right test, it's running it, and if we wanted to step into that or step over that, we could. I'm going to actually step over it here. But if you think about it, I didn't remove the breakpoint that we set earlier in the actual application code. So not only can I set breakpoints in my test code, but I can set them in my app code, and I can step through and validate just like we were talking about earlier, right? So you can run Espresso tests from your IDE just like this to validate that they're working or why they're broken. You can also make sure that they're stable on different devices before you check them in with the rest of your application code. Like for instance, I will be doing that with Git in just a moment. So in this case, we have the same exact context that's available, variables that are going on. We can inspect and introspect into those as well. I'm just going to resume it. It's going to continue and finish up the test, close out the application, and guess what? Not surprising because this is a demonstration, but our tests passed successfully. So, to recap, Let me go back over to the slides. Just keep in mind, Espresso is great, Appium is great, and there's no one testing tool that does everything. So this is an example of what one of my my coworkers here, Ron Kinsbrunner, who does the Digital Test Coverage Index, that he experienced on his drive into the city one day through the Waze app. And it got him thinking, like, this is reality now. The reality is that we have varying levels of power consumption. We are in our location services are hyper relevant to pretty much everything we do now. Our network bandwidth really changes the dynamics of how our app functions over the wire, across the wire, over a network. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on in the background of the device. So really what we need to do is think about testing not just in terms of what test tool or what test code we're writing, but more importantly, what's our test strategy? And we'll talk about that once we get to CI a little bit more in detail too. Just consider, there's no one tool that tests it all. And so you might need to employ multiple test frameworks to do different things, to elicit different behaviors. And this really depends on a number of factors. The short of it is, look, you have different types of apps. Your organization, like I said earlier today, this is a room full of developers and QA, right? We have different skill sets, and that's okay. But we need to match to those to really go fast. There's different context-based testing that we need to do, and test coverage requirements, specifically the platforms and the capabilities on the app, are really important to consider when you are working with your test technologies. And once again, Iran has done a great job breaking that down for us, a pros and cons list of what works and what doesn't, what's included in each of the popular test frameworks. And there's a link to this here, bit.ly/OSS-test-choices. So the third way that we speed things up is once we've got these awesome tests and once they're stable, we want to ship them somewhere. We don't want to run these all by ourselves. Like, you know, we've done the job of automating this thing. What does the automation for us? Well, in most cases, it's a continuous integration environment. In my case, for today, the example is Jenkins, right? But just because you can automate a thing doesn't mean it's going to run fast for you. And so there's a couple of ways that you can actually make these tests run faster. More specifically, I want to narrow in on what's really a challenge unless you have the right infrastructure and the right reliable platform to do that, namely parallel testing. So think about, this is just my drawing about a pipeline of how code gets all the way out to production. But think about how to make this thing faster, right? There's a lot of different stages, a lot of different components, and a lot of different quality gates, or I call them opportunities to have safety nets, right, along the way. You know, when you're checking your code in, you might do some peer code review. That might be a safety net that you employ. When you're building the app, of course, you know, missing files from a commit will oftentimes be one of the #1 reasons why builds fail. So that's, the build itself is a safety net. When you start merging code together from lots of different contributors, that itself is a safety net. But once that's done, oftentimes we run build verification, which includes things like unit testing. We run unit tests on every build, right? We might also do some integration testing on each build that pops out of our CI process. Those builds go elsewhere too. They go to longer automated regression testing cycles, maybe even some manual acceptance testing, for instance. But the whole point of this thing is to speed up the process by which we get to a go, no-go decision, so that we know that when we deploy this thing, that we have high confidence that it's going to do what we're supposed to do, right? Unfortunately, if you don't have reliable automation and infrastructure underlying this entire process, the whole thing is suspect. The whole thing is up for grabs. So if one of these components is not working properly, the whole chain suffers. And so what we find is that when people try to introduce real devices into any one of these processes, but especially at high volumes in continuous integration, now all of a sudden reliability becomes a really important part of the platform that you use to do that. So let's drill in real quick and make the point and the case for parallel testing. You know, at first you might think, oh, parallel testing, of course. But let's actually think about that in two ways. First, for a much earlier and often build verification test, and that might include just a few very key devices for you. There's a couple of the devices you know are the vast majority of your target market, meaning if you make a code change and it breaks for those, you want to know about that ASAP, as soon as possible. So maybe we're doing this build 5 times per day or more. It could be more or less for you, but it's often. And that's on a couple of critical platforms. And so what we want to do is actually run those tests on those critical platforms in parallel. And that goes from taking a really long time to not taking a long time at all. But if you think about going further down the pipe and going and running all of your tests in an automated regression test suite, you might also run those on a much larger set of devices. So the variety of your devices is to make sure that you're really capturing any defects that show up across a much bigger safety net. And so this might have to happen nightly because, quite frankly, it's a longer process. You've got more tests. That's okay. But you also have more platforms. And you might also want to introduce conditions. And so the fact is, this concept of parallel testing applies equally to both in terms of how to speed things up. What we're driving for in both of these circumstances is fast feedback, but fast and complete feedback. Complete meaning the devices that you know elicit problems and that you absolutely need to cover at certain periods of time. And actually I want to turn this over to Roy for a second because there's an example of how a strategy for how teams will often do this, and it's actually a conversation point that he's used to open up the conversation to how people do things.
Yes, Paul, I think it's, part of what teams are trying to do is to get the feedback early, right? And, you talked about parallel execution as part of reduce the time for them to get reliable feedback. Reliable meaning that they want to know that they get a good coverage. They want to know that they have validation on real end-user environment, which means real devices, the different operating system, the different environments. What we see here is kind of a proposal, and the discussion that we usually do with development team is to break down and define the different jobs that they have in their CI servers and define what is the goal, what we're trying to achieve. So for example, if we're looking at a commit job, we want to make sure that when a developer is making a change, commit to the master, to the source control, they get immediate feedback. Okay, that can be 5 to 15 minutes. It depends on the team or what kind of application they develop. But they want to know end to end from the moment I make the commit till the moment I get the feedback that it's working and I'm ready to move to my next task. The next one is to look at multiple jobs, multiple changes, and run more intensive testing to understand what's really happened with the app. Okay, so it means, for example, that we'll execute all the unit tests, some part of our system tests and smoke tests in order to know that things are working. And it's, again, everything is defined on how much time we want to get the feedback and what level of confidence we are willing to take here. And this is how you build the entire table. This may change between different teams. This may change between different apps, but that's the high-level concept and the idea behind it.
Yeah, there's a few areas here that developers might be familiar with when it comes to integration testing, things like API tests, right? They can also be represented in your strategy and should, by the way, so that people kind of understand what it takes to actually accomplish that early and fast feedback. Because quite frankly, think about who suffers when you don't get that feedback. I mean, if it makes it to production, it's users. And that sucks. That's just sad. But on the other hand, ultimately, it's us, it's you, it's the people on the call right now, which are developers, right? Developers suffer when a defect escapes. They're the ones that are responsible to fix it. And so why not just, think about the context switching that you have to do. If let's say a defect escapes so late that it's been like a week or 2 weeks since you worked on that code. You've been working on so many other things. It's hard to get back into the mindset of how to fix that thing. So if that feedback can happen, in fact, I'm actually going to switch over. If that feedback can happen very quickly, I'm just going to change a test and do a commit. We'll see what that looks like. If that feedback can happen really quick, then that makes total sense. So let me actually go and make a commit here. I'll actually push that change as well. That's basically what I've done is I've changed the test to purposely break so that we can kind of see the process that this code goes through. So as you can see, the IDE is saying, hey, we're pushing it. That's fine. No, that's fine. And it said the push was successful. Now, remember I said that I would show you an example in Jenkins, and I've got that somewhere here. Here we go. There we go. So let me just log into my Jenkins server, and we'll actually see that, oh, in the meantime, if we look at the job that's responsible for building and testing this Android app, which I've created here, it automatically kicked off. So just because I committed, I was able to trigger a build command on this specific branch, on my own branch. Now, let's actually drill in for a second and see what's going on while that's being built. Well, just as you might expect, standard build tasks are being run, in this case by Gradle. But again, if you're familiar with the Maven framework, that's the same sort of similar thing. I haven't spent a lot of time talking about web, but similar thing is true. What we can do is we don't just provide physical mobile devices, we provide a whole range of real web browsers and web browsing environments as well for you. So for you web developers that are out there, all these workflows, there are similarities to that as well. So the build was successful. Awesome. We see that in our resources here, in our results. And there, I already have a script written that essentially uses the API to do that. In fact, I think I have a visual on the next slide of what we're looking at. So in Jenkins, it's running a script that uses our RESTful API to orchestrate the process of uploading, installing, registering on devices, and then running those Android tests. And so with a few RESTful calls, we can actually automate the entire process of doing end-to-end testing there using Espresso or XCTest. But same paradigm exists on the WebDriver side. You'd just be using the remote WebDriver implementation we have for the Perfecto Cloud. And then that allows you to introduce things like visual validation in your code. You can actually specify things like images to compare your app to and inject audio streams and stuff. And so that works for Appium, but also for Selenium as well. And ultimately, the idea is when we go back to Jenkins, what we'll see at the end is that the Espresso test that we just ran, remember, I just changed something in there. Oh, look, they failed. As you can see, execution, it says execution completed with one failed test out of the tests that we were running. And so I can actually look and see in real time, drill down into the details of what happened on this device. So just like any report that we create from our cloud, you can actually go and look at what happened during that run. Now, if you're in an IDE and you're working on this in real time, you don't need the playback in most cases, but when it executes from CI, it really does help to have all the context that was going on that device. And so that includes not just playback video, but also things like, what we're running, what apps are running in the background, some of the device vitals, right? The steps that were executed. And so with one or two clicks, you can get into the details of what happened and see that actually occur. In fact, we could see that on the other tab in our plugin. Now, if I reran this and recommitted this, in a few moments, we would see devices being spun up in our cloud right here that were part of that build, that were part of my name, that were checked out in my name. The really cool thing is you can actually perpetuate things like the git committer all the way through to the recording, to the test results. And so in this case, now you actually have traceability, as well as if you wanted to hook it up to if you wanted to continue to integrate into things like Slack notifications, for instance. If you wanted to actually push that to Slack and let the developer know, hey, that thing you just committed, it broke 12 of our tests. You might want to check that out. You might want to figure out why that's the case. Is it the tests? Do we need to do test maintenance, or is it more like the app actually broke something on critical devices? So moving on, just a quick view of what that looks like on the WebDriver side. I won't spend too much time, but it's the standard stuff. You instantiate a remote WebDriver, you point it to your Perfecto cloud, right? And then you set up parameters and capabilities for that.
Yeah, so just to add one comment here is, we have an API that gives you the ability to either to use an existing solutions that we provide, or to fully integrate that to whatever tools or technologies that you're using very easily. So, that's essential in order to make sure that you are not tuning the tools to your processes, that you are not tuning the processes to your tools, but you actually use the tools to align to your processes, to what you're trying to achieve. And this can be easily done with APIs and the solutions that we provide as part of our Perfecto APIs today.
Right. So the last thing I want to talk about is what it means to have better feedback. Now, we just saw an example of a drill-in, a report that was really the test execution. But in fact, we have a unified reporting library that allows you to go from a level of detail all the way and kind of zoom in and out from detail or overview. And as it turns out, this is super powerful, not just for individual developers, but especially once you start thinking of quality as baked into the process, right, as a team responsibility. And so to be able to collaborate and share these things becomes really important once you start to take responsibility for that. And so what we see here is the detailed report on, in this case, a web application being run. In this case, there was a specific motion to click a button, and right after that, there was a validation that was a visual validation. We had asserted that visual should have a specific visual component on it by way of our JPEG image here. And as it turns out, it didn't. And so this is a level of detail that's really great to get in things like Slack as part of the fast feedback early on. But also when you've got test engineers maybe on the team who need to show you a detailed list of what's going on, so you as the developer can reproduce that in your own environment. And so if we think about this as a level of detail, if we zoom out one level, we also have views that help you see sort of which specific builds are having problems across multiple, let's say, projects, if you will. This is at the build level. So what we can see is that, this week, build status was not so good compared to last week. Last week we were doing great. This week things started to slow down. And so we can vary in the very early stages of a sprint cycle or of an iterative pass over new functionality. We can literally see that the metrics of our entire process sometimes face potential trouble. We can see that trouble early on. Conversely, if we were in trouble, like if a lot of builds were failing because we were doing a lot of work and maybe there was less time for peer code review early on, what we can also see is that we've improved quality over time. So that's what you see here.
Yeah, build health is one of the most critical metrics for teams to track. It's a good way to know if you're in the right direction, if you're in building an app in high quality, or if we do see build break too frequently, then we know that we have a problem, something that we should look at and solve.
So this is one level up from the detail, right? This is build status, if you will. Let's do one level up from that. Whoa, right? What just happened? Well, now we can see a variety of different ways to slice the results, meaning the feedback coming back from our entire pipeline, meaning that you can see the results of long-term regression testing. You can also see the impact on smoke tests, that, you know, the more tests that you're starting to introduce after every build, the more critical it is to make sure that's super green, right? We like an always green status, and not just on our builds, but on the quality factors. And so without doing automated testing, you have less visibility, immediate visibility over that. So this is a dashboard that shows split between what types of tests, but it could also be across different, let's say, platforms, and maybe even different projects as well. So yeah, the ability to be able to zoom in and out really gives you context, gives you versatility between your contexts. You can see the build health and zoom into detail, or you can start with detail and zoom out and say, well, what else is breaking? You know, what's the trend here? What's the pattern? So this is highly valuable for practitioners, for developers, for test engineers, but also for team managers, you know, development managers, QA managers and directors, and then at the executive view, to be able to see something as core and as relevant as we are really in the digital age now, to be able to see something as important as your delivery pipeline, the engine of your business, to see the health of that becomes really helpful to start collaborating about how to fix problems, how to improve the process. So really, to kind of sum it up,
Yeah, so I think if we look at the process and we look at CI and how to optimize CI, there are three main phases as I see them. As the first one is, you know, to understand how to develop your test automation properly, to make sure that they are efficient and they are reliable, that you can execute them and count on them to be stable and reliable. So if something breaks, they really detect a problem, either a problem in the test or a problem in the app, rather than a problem in the environment. The second one is, once we figure that out, to see how we execute, how we run more tests in parallel, and how we reduce the time for feedback. Okay, Paul talked about this earlier, and that's a big challenge, and we do see some teams kind of struggle with that. I think it's an important point. And the next one is how to introduce more reports, because now we get into a point that every developer now executes multiple changes a day. Each one trigger a set of test execution, and we start to get a lot of reports. We want to first of all, we want to know how to isolate the problem as quick as possible, to know who is the developer that made a change that need to fix it now. And secondly, we want to start to get a quality overview as part of our build health to know that we are on the right track to go to production. So those are three kind of key capabilities that are required in order to be ready for continuous quality, continuous delivery.
So just to sum up, because we're approaching the hour now, we've covered the fact that you can really integrate real devices effectively into your workflows now. This is a new thing. There's nobody else that can help you with that problem like Perfecto can, particularly when it comes to validating new features and debugging applications. The second thing is, of course, you can now use other test frameworks to further enrich and to improve the feedback and the speed at which you build, test, and ultimately ship your applications. And also how important not only parallel testing is, but proper coverage at the right times. Hopefully, and we'll actually send this out we'll send the deck out with the email, the thank you email, once we get the recording done. So you have this as a reference, because in so many conversations, Roy, that you've had with customers, prospects, development teams, I've sat in on a few of them, and as soon as you start to talk in terms of like, where are you with this test strategy, going back to that grid, they start to lighten up. They start to go, well, we're great here, we're not so great here, this is an area for improvement, and it really lightens up the conversation.
Yes, definitely. And I think that, what's encouraging that we do see more developers are aware to the fact that quality is part of their, job definition, part of their responsibility to make sure that they not only provide new functionality, but they provide a new functionality that works for the end users. And that's key to make sure that that's part of the process. Go back to the challenges that we talked about at the beginning of the session: short cycles, short releases, high velocity.
And then the last thing we kind of looked at was, once you have better feedback from reporting, like how does that really improve your process? How does it improve your individual metrics, like how quickly can you resolve bugs? But also, how does it improve the team concept of how to deal with issues that aren't just bugs, but are process issues, and how to overcome those as well? Just that visibility is key to that. So at this point, there's a few minutes for questions, and I just want to encourage you, the next webinar we're having is specifically on Espresso. A number of people from, we did this webinar earlier this morning, and a number of developers and QA folks, quality engineering folks, also said that they would love to see more about Espresso. And so there are a couple of articles on our blog about it. I also have a personal blog, paulsbruce.io, where I've been doing a lot of work around Espresso, Jenkins, and particularly Docker. So if you're at all interested in that, you can look at those. But I would encourage you to check out our next webinar, Espresso for Fast and Reliable Feedback.
Okay, so Paul, we have few questions. The first one is it possible to integrate Jira for reporting bugs and defects? That's a good question. Some of the capabilities are available today. You can integrate links and reports. We do have API for the reports. We are looking to provide down the road some of those capabilities fully integrated into the product, and we will update once we have those available, hopefully in the near future.
I think one of the themes here too is that, we don't just arbitrarily create things here. We rely on the feedback. We rely on conversations with you to really make sure that we're bringing you something that actually helps you do your job better, that gets you back to code, that gets you back to quality. So in that way, please reach out to your reps and just talk about this. Get on a call with them, and maybe we'll be hooked up to that conversation as well. So
yeah, fully agree. Let's take one or two more questions. One of the questions here is, does Perfecto integration is available with Xcode as well? So it's a good question. We are going to provide the dev tunnel capability for iOS as well. It's going to be available in the near future for our customers. For some of them, it's already available as an early access program. And if you're interested, please contact your customer success manager or your sales rep, and that can be fully integrated into Xcode, and we can walk you through the process and the flow, how that works. Let's take one last question, which is about how well does this work with hybrid Angular JS apps? So it's a very good question. Fully integrate. You can. We didn't spend a lot of time about this, but you can also debug and validate your web application with the capability that we've mentioned. We can have a follow-up session with the person who asked and explain exactly how that can be done using the standard tools that you guys are working with today, the relevant IDEs and developer tools.
One of those hybrid frameworks, actually there's a blog from last week on the Perfecto blog. That's blog.perfectomobile.com. So look for a blog from me, Paul, about React Native. And this is an example of using DevTunnel to actually debug React Native apps. So by all means, check that out. Just an example.
So, just last comment from my side, Paul. I think that today we covered, some of the exciting new capabilities that Perfecto released in the last couple of months. There is more to come. We do see this the need, and we do understand that that's coming. If you have the need to, if you do see those capabilities relevant for you, if you do have interest, please contact your customer success manager. Please contact your sales reps or contact us through those channels that we've mentioned at the beginning, and we will be happy to walk you through those capabilities and help you to understand how you can get this, the value of those capabilities.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Roy.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, everybody on the call. Truly thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Cheers.